These are 5 reasons why I am not a Mormon. Now, 4 years ago, I recorded a video that was 5 problems with the Book of Mormon. But Mormonism is more than just the Book of Mormon. So I wanted to do something a little more broad. It's something that I've been asked to do, to revisit this topic and just give 5 reasons why I don't find the claims of Mormonism to be compelling. And I am not convinced of them. And the more that I've done research since that time, the less and less convinced I am of the veracity of Mormon truth claims. So I'm going to give 5 reasons why I find problems with Mormonism. The first is the character of Joseph Smith himself. Now, it's important to note that in a religion like Mormonism, and this is true of other religions as well, so if we're talking about the figure of Muhammad in Islam, or even L. Ron Hubbard with Scientology, when there are some religions where there is one central figure in that religion, and especially when the primary religious text of that group is given to a particular individual, a single individual, you really have to rely on the trustworthiness of that particular individual in order to trust the truth claims of that religion. So when you have something like Christianity, you look at the New Testament, we're looking at a variety of authors and a variety of sources that are testifying to the same truth claims. So we have the apostles like Matthew or like John, but then we have other authors like Mark and Luke. We have Paul. So there are a number of individuals who are testifying to the same things. So we're not reliant just on one particular individual's testimony in terms of our verification of the truth claims of that religion. But with Mormonism, we really are left with one particular figure. Now, I recognize, of course, that there are plenty of other individuals that have the testimony to supposedly seeing the plates. We have two different sets of witnesses there. But when we're speaking about those who have directly received revelation, who actually had written out that revelation, who were visited by an angel, we really have just Joseph Smith. And so the religion in some ways stands or falls with the reliability of the character of Joseph Smith. Now, I do want to say, because I know when you're talking about Mormon apologists, and I'm very familiar with Mormon apologetics, I've watched many, many hours of lectures of Mormon apologists defending the claims, the truth claims of their religion. Oftentimes, these figures will mention that, well, there are plenty of people in the Bible that have problematic past. And if you look at someone like a Richard Bushman, who has done some very good historical work on Joseph Smith, they're certainly willing to acknowledge the problems with Joseph Smith. But generally they'll say things like, well, Joseph Smith had problems, but so did David, and we still trust him. So did Abraham, so did Noah, these figures in the Old Testament and New Testament as well. Peter denied Christ prior to his death. So we have a lot of sinful behavior on the part of just humans, because this is just what happens when you are human. Other than our Lord Jesus, everyone has sins. So Joseph Smith's sins are really no different from anybody else's. Well, I think that we're dealing with something far more important than just the question of, is Joseph Smith a sinner? But because we have to rely on his claims regarding the source of the Book of Mormon, we can ask a more fundamental question, which is Joseph Smith trustworthy? Does he have the characteristics of a witness that would be trustworthy? Is he the kind of individual that if he stood up in a courtroom and we saw his past, we would say, this man has a record of speaking things that are true and his testimony is very trustworthy? And I just don't think we have that when you look at the life and character of Joseph Smith. For example, he was involved in treasure digging. He had this stone that he would place into a hat, and famously he used that in terms of his translation of the Book of Mormon, but he used this prior to that as well. He did this for treasure digging, and he would receive payment to go around and supposedly find treasure. Now, this is something that happened in the 19th century. We have divining rods and all sorts of things, especially when you get like the gold rush. Everybody's looking for gold. Everybody's looking for treasures, thinking that they can, maybe find something secret hidden. And if they do that, they'll make a fortune and they'll change their life. So Joseph Smith does that, but he's not very successful in doing that. Now, we could say, Joseph Smith seems like a rather trustworthy guy who has, some kind of supernatural abilities. If, say, there was a long record of Joseph Smith really finding treasure, whereas these other people seem to be scamming others, but Joseph Smith was successful over and over and over again. He seemed to have these magical abilities where he really knew where this treasure was, but that's just not the case. So if we see that that is not trustworthy, if he uses the same exact method in translating the plates, that should tell us that maybe that's not trustworthy either. There are two other things that I would point to in terms of Joseph Smith's character that really do matter quite a bit. And there's a lot more that we could talk about, but for the sake of brevity, I'm trying to summarize in this video. So one is the nature of his relationships, his extramarital relationships. Now, that starts with Fanny Alger, and there are then many other women that Joseph Smith is seemingly intimate with. After that, now Mormon historians are going to make the argument, of course, that these are marriages, so that these are polygamous marriages and they are God ordained. They are not affairs or anything like that. But I think the bigger problem, I mean, that's a problem in and of itself, but maybe another problem, we're talking about his trustworthiness. So we could say a lot about the character of a guy who's going to just marry a bunch of women. But beyond that, think about how he dealt with this with his wife. Now, it's very clear that he did not speak to Emma about these relationships, at least initially. He was married, supposedly, to these other women, and Emma found out about that later, and then Joseph Smith claimed that he had received a revelation from God that he was supposed to have these polygamous marriages. But beyond that, at the time that we know that Joseph Smith is involved in polygamous marriages, and that also includes his marrying women who are already married to other men, we know that he is lying to the public about this. He's accused of polygamy. He's outright saying publicly that he's not practicing these things as he is, which means that his word isn't trustworthy. He's saying one thing to one group of people, that would be his wives, and he's saying another thing to the public. So this definitely puts into question the trustworthiness of this man's character and his words. The second is that we have a number of prophecies that Joseph Smith made that simply didn't happen. And so, we could do this with a prophet. If someone says, I have a direct revelation from God, we can look at that revelation and say, okay, did that revelation come to pass? This is something the Old Testament tells us to do with prophets to verify their prophecies. For example, he prophesies that there, within a certain period of time, Jesus is going to return. So it's 1891 is kind of the cutoff date. And it's very clear as you read a number of other individuals within the LDS Church following Joseph Smith that this was still the expectation, at least immediately, that before that generation died out, that first generation, Jesus would return. Clearly, that did not happen. So there we have a prophecy that was not fulfilled. We have many others. There was supposed to be a temple built in Independence, Missouri at a particular place, and it did not happen. It is now acknowledged that that was not something that was going to be the case, and we should not necessarily ever expect that to happen. So those are only two examples. We have a number of other minor ones as well. But as you look throughout Joseph Smith's life, we simply see a pattern that his words are not necessarily to be trusted. He doesn't tell the truth. We see that when his, supernatural powers are tested, like gold digging, doesn't happen. He prophesies, and when those prophecies are given, they're not fulfilled. So that's the first reason why I'm not a Mormon. So the second reason is the lack of evidence for the historical claims found within the Book of Mormon. Now, the Book of Mormon certainly makes historical claims. Just like the Bible does, it is placed in a particular location at a particular point in time. And when that happens, we can go back and look at those places and look at those times and ask, is there evidence that such things actually occurred? Now, what we shouldn't expect to find is an abundance of evidence of everything that happened. When we're talking about archaeological discoveries, it's quite minimal in terms of what we actually have. It's a newer discipline. We're constantly finding new things. So we shouldn't expect to verify every event in the Book of Mormon by any means. But we should be able to identify at least one thing in the Book of Mormon. Because as you do look at biblical archaeology, it's true that there are a lot of questions about certain datings of certain findings, and there are things that we haven't found that we may have expected to have found at this point. Of course, as time goes on, I think we do continue to find more and more things, and eventually we'll be able to fill in a lot of those gaps that we haven't been able to yet. But no one can question that a lot of the things in the Bible have been verified, both the Old and the New Testament. We have specific historical locations. We have places we can look. We have things that we can identify. We can actually look at, say, the ancient Near Eastern culture surrounding Israel and look at the Old Testament and say, how does this fit into these other historical texts that went on around this time period? But with the Book of Mormon, we simply don't have anything like that. Now, this partially has to do with the fact that there is a debate about where the Book of Mormon actually occurred. Now, the older perspective, which I absolutely think was Joseph Smith's perspective, and I think he said some very specific things about this, which make it abundantly clear, is what now is called the Heartland theory. And that is that according to Joseph Smith, according to his own statements, and you could find a lot of these records. Now the Joseph Smith papers have been continually released, which means that we have more access to Joseph Smith's own writings and words than we ever did in the past. So we have, I think, abundant historical evidence to say that Joseph Smith believed that the Native Americans were actually descendants of the ancient Israelites. And these are ideas that precede Joseph Smith. There are some ideas about this prior to that as well. And that when he talks about the Lamanites and the Nephites, these are inhabitants of what we now refer to as the United States. And Joseph Smith receives certain revelations while he is in the United States of locations where certain things actually happened, which makes it, I think, hard to grab onto the other theories that now are much more common. So the Heartland theory simply doesn't have anything to verify it. Now, you do find some people like Rod Meldrum and others who do some kind of lectures. They do some tours, specifically in the Utah area, and try to verify the claims of the Book of Mormon, claiming that there is ancient Hebrew script and that was found in the Americas, and they have these ideas that the Mound peoples were actually peoples from the Book of Mormon. And all of this, if you look at the evidence when it's presented in like a PowerPoint presentation, it can sound really compelling, but it doesn't take much research at all to look at the particular findings that they're going to use to say, these are pretty clearly fraudulent. There are a lot of fraudulent historical things going on in the 19th century, and that's because this is the beginning of the fields of things like archaeology. So everybody wants to kind of become famous and make a quick buck out of finding something that has some kind of really intense historical significance. And it's an easy way to make money. Just like we talked about. This is what Joseph Smith is trying to do with his gold digging kind of stuff, or treasure seeking. So this is something similar. It's an easy way to make money. So that means that you have to really put these things to the test to see if they are credible. And when you do that with these various things that supposedly are testimonies or witnesses to ancient Hebrew being present in the Americas, they all simply fall apart. I mean, none of the findings are even really contestable. And this is what most Book of Mormon or Mormon scholars are going to recognize. So most Mormon historians in academic fields, they're not going to buy into this because they know it's an impossibility. So that's why people like Rod Meldrum and others that share these ideas, just they're not clued in on Mormon history. They don't know anything about, well, not just Mormon history, but history. I mean, they don't know anything about archaeology. That's not their field. They're coming in as outsiders, and they see this evidence and want to put these things together to defend the Book of Mormon, but it's really not there. Okay, so then the perspective that's taken by most scholars and most historians at LDS institutions now is the Mesoamerican theory. And so this theory says that the peoples in the Book of Mormon settled in Mesoamerica, not far up north. They settled far further south in small people groups, meaning that there were not that many people, as was previously claimed. So the Heartland theory will say the Native Americans as a whole are probably descended somehow from the ancient Israelites. And they have this whole haplogroup X argument that is wrong. I'm talking to like geneticists. They all say that this is wrong. But nonetheless, I'm no expert in this area, but I talk to people who are and who know this field and say, no, that is not verifiable evidence that there's any relation to the Hebrews. But because now that the study of genetics has increased and we've learned a lot more, we can actually test the DNA of peoples, and we know that the Native Americans don't have ties to the ancient Israelites. There simply is, there's no DNA evidence that such is the case. So that's generally been rejected, except for those Greater Heartland peoples. So what happens then is the Book of Mormon geography shrinks to a very small location, the narrow neck of land, as the book itself states, so they grab onto that. And that it's such a small people group that eventually, they're going to intermarry with the peoples that are already there, so that the genetic markers that we may have to identify them as Israelites simply are not there. So it's really more so than an argument for actual evidence. It's trying to make an excuse why there isn't evidence. And this just simply shows that it's not compelling. There has to be something compelling about the archaeological evidence that shows that anything within the Book of Mormon is verified. And, I understand some of the arguments. There's, Bountiful supposedly is a land that's really been found. And we could talk about all of that, but this is a brief video, so I can't deal with everything. But in terms of the actual land that the majority of the Book of Mormon actually happens in, and the events that occur within the Americas somewhere, there is no historical evidence. So it's really difficult to hold on to the truth claims when there's, I'm not expecting an abundance of evidence, just anything. The third reason that I am not a Mormon is the Mormon doctrine of God, in the contradictions between the Mormon doctrine of God and the biblical exposition of who God is. Now, this is theologically the most significant issue that we can look at. We can certainly also talk about the nature of salvation and the role of grace in salvation. That's pretty key as well. But we have to start with the question of, well, who is God? I mean, that's the most fundamental question of religion, right? Who is the God that we worship? What is his identity? How are we speaking about him? How many gods are there? So if there's a fundamental difference in that basic question, what you end up with is a very different religion. So Mormonism has a very different way of answering this question than historic Christianity does. Now, I will say that once you look at the earlier writings of Joseph Smith, say when you're reading the Book of Mormon itself, it doesn't appear that there is an idea of multiple gods. It does not appear to be a polytheistic text. So, for example, in the Book of Mormon, in the Book of Alma, chapter 11, Amulek is asked at one point, is there more than one God? And gives the answer no. This is Alma 11, 28, and 29. And if you read further there, it's very clear that Joseph Smith at this point basically has a traditional kind of Christian approach to God. Now, I could say there's some problems with this Trinitarian language because I don't think he really understands the Trinity very well. But basically, he has a historic view of who God is. So look at Moroni 8:18, for example. For I know that God is not a partial God, neither a changeable being, but he is unchangeable from all eternity to all eternity. And so this is what is known as the doctrine of immutability, that God is fundamentally unchangeable. It's a wonderful statement. It's a statement that's consistent there with what I would confess, what is confessed in Scripture, what's confessed in the Lutheran confessions, which I'm a Lutheran, so I subscribe to those, the exposition of Scripture that's presented in what's called the Book of Concord of 1580, and various other Christian traditions. So Westminster Confession of Faith, the Roman Catholic tradition, we're all going to affirm that, yeah, that's a pretty good definition of the immutability of God. But it's clear that in Joseph Smith's later writings, this shifts. So no longer does Joseph Smith later hold to a notion of God as an unchangeable being, really in any sense at all. This is probably clearest in the Book of Abraham. In the Book of Abraham, you have the creation narrative, but in that creation narrative, there is a mention of a multiplicity of gods. So there are the gods, there's a council of gods that are involved in the actual event of creation. So that's pretty clear, a pretty clear language of polytheism there. But in terms of the changeability of God, right? So a classical Christian confession is the immutability of God, which I'm saying even Joseph Smith held to the immutability of God at the beginnings of Mormonism. This then shifts later. This is most famously outlined in the King Follett Discourse by Joseph Smith. So let me just briefly address this, and you can find this whole sermon online. So you can look up King Follett Discourse and find this. And this is toward the end of his life here. So this was never expanded upon, I don't think, to the extent that Joseph Smith would have. It is by Brigham Young, but it's hard to say what was consistent between the two figures. In order to understand the subject of the dead for consolation of those who mourn for the loss of their friends, it is necessary that we should understand the character and being of God, and how he came to be so. For I am going to tell you how God came to be God. We have imagined and supposed that God was God from all eternity. I will refute that idea and take away the veil so that you may see. All right, so that is pretty clear, I think, when we read that text from Joseph Smith, that he does not believe that God was even always God. So he does not believe in a singular God. He's not a monotheist. And he does not any longer believe in the immutability of God. We essentially are all gods in embryo. And according to a Mormon theology or Mormon anthropology, we are gods. And God himself, the God that we worship, was once like us. You know, we have the famous Lorenzo Snow couplet, as God now is, as man now is, God once was, and as God now is, man one day will become. So that we are of the same kind. We are of the same kind of being as God. Now that's a fundamentally different picture of God from what is in the biblical narrative. So, for example, the book of Isaiah, specifically chapters 45 through 48, have a lot of statements about the uniqueness of the God of Israel and the distinction between God and humanity as well. So I'll just read part of this for you, but you can read all three of those chapters. In verse 5, he says this, I am the Lord, and there is no other. There is no God beside me. And then he goes on, there is no one beside me. I am the Lord, and there is no other. I form the light and create darkness. I make peace and create calamity. I, the Lord, do all these things. So that's pretty clear. The prophet Isaiah is very, very clear that God is God. There is no other God. We are not gods. We are made in the image of God, but we are not little gods that can become like he is. In fact, the whole basis of our worship is the otherness of God. This is what the word holy means, one who is other. And so the reason we worship God at all is because that God is unlike us. So to say that we are just gods in seed form is to really destroy the foundation of worship and the entire foundation of our faith. So there you go. That is a very essential reason, and probably the most essential reason why I am not Mormon. The fourth reason I'm not Mormon is the Book of Abraham. And really, this is probably the reason, historical reasoning, that the majority of people give, that I see, who leave Mormonism for historical reasons, who leave Mormonism for reasons of like intellectual veracity of the claims of Mormonism. And that is because it's just really hard to sustain a belief in the testimony of Joseph Smith and his ability as a translator when you see the testimony of what the Book of Abraham is. Now, essentially, if you're not familiar with the Book of Abraham, it's a text that's part of the scriptures of the Mormon Church. It is not just the Book of Mormon. That is the first text that you generally read, but there are other scriptures as well. So you have the Pearl of Great Price, you have Doctrine and Covenants, and then you have the Book of Mormon. And they also use the Bible. There is a Joseph Smith translation of the Bible that was not completed, but that's also not the official translation of the Bible that they use. They generally use the King James. But so one of the sacred texts is, right, the book of Abraham. Now, the Book of Abraham was something that Joseph Smith purchased. And this is a time in the 19th century when Egyptology as a field is growing. It's in its beginning phases. And there are, tours of like mummies. I went to see this, the King Tut exhibit, I remember when I was a kid. And this is the beginnings of that in the 19th century. So people are really interested in ancient Egypt and exploring this ancient culture. And there are new documents that are found. So Joseph Smith ends up purchasing these documents. And supposedly he has two writings. We only have one that was translated, but he also supposedly has a writing from Joseph. But this is not the New Testament Joseph, but we're talking about Joseph, the patriarch, as in Jacob's son Joseph. But this one document, it's a scroll, supposedly it's pretty lengthy, and it is translated as a book that is written by Abraham. And we have access to the scroll today. And when we look at that scroll today, we see that it is actually the Egyptian Book of the Dead. It is not what Joseph Smith claimed it to be. So here we have like a pretty clear historical proof. We have Joseph Smith saying this text is one thing. We can actually look at the text. Now we know how to actually translate it, and we know what it is. We know what it says, and we know that the things that it says are not consistent with what Joseph Smith claimed. So it seems like a pretty cut and dry case when you look into this. And I do have a separate video that I did on the Book of Abraham. So if you want to look into this, into a little more of the specific details here. Mormon apologists do have ways of addressing this. You can look at people like Kerry Muhlestein, who is he is an Egyptologist and tries to make some connections. And I think the case is very weak. I think it's a very, very weak case. So what are some of the arguments that are made? Well, one of the arguments that you're going to see from some apologists is going to be, well, there are some parallels between this book and Abraham, which they're really not very clear at all. Okay, and then one of the other arguments is going to be, well, there are some ancient traditions about Abraham that we have that kind of seem to line up in little ways with what we see about the Book of Abraham. The parallels are not that strong, and it doesn't really prove much of anything. But a major argument that you're going to hear is that the Book of Abraham supposedly was not really translated in the way that we think of a translation being made. In other words, it was that when Joseph Smith saw the scroll, which was the Egyptian Book of the Dead, he was inspired to write down the Book of Abraham, but it wasn't a direct translation of the Book of Abraham. Now, I think that's just a really hard thesis to sustain. I understand that they're kind of forced into that position, but I think it's pretty clear what Joseph Smith said that he was doing. I mean, why would you need to buy an Egyptian text that has a bunch of words on it and then say it's the text written by the hand of Abraham, he says, specifically? Like, why wouldn't God, I mean, at that point, if you're not even translating the same text, why couldn't you just grab a random text and have it inspire you? It's very strange, and I don't think that there's evidence within anything that Joseph Smith said which would lend credence to that. Now, the other argument is that the portion that Joseph Smith actually translated has been lost, and what we have is not actually the portion that was the Book of Abraham. And some of that has to do with the fact that Joseph Smith did speak about, I think it was Joseph Smith, there may have been some people that had seen the document, actually, now that I'm thinking about it. But there's at least a historical witness that talks about the length of the book. And well, the book doesn't seem that long now, so probably part of it was missing. It just seems far too convenient that it had the entirety of the Book of Abraham on it, but the portion that was lost just so happens to be like the portion that Joseph Smith translated. You see this with also their problems with the figures. So there are images in this text that Joseph Smith interprets in a particular way that he says is a picture of Abraham on an altar he's going to be sacrificed. Well, now we know enough about the fields of Egyptology to actually know what that scene is, and that's just not a correct interpretation of the scene. And so it's what's called the lion couch scene. And you can read quite a bit about this if you want to look in more detail. But there are ways to try to answer this as well. And the answers are not compelling. I think here's a pretty clear-cut case where we have Joseph Smith claiming one thing, and we can look at the evidence. We historically know what's going on, and it's not the case. It's not what he said. All right, so there is your fourth reason why I am not a Mormon. Now, the fifth reason that I'm not a Mormon is the many contradictions within Mormon history. So the problem is this, and everybody has, contradictions within the history of their movements or their churches or whatever. But the Mormon Church makes particular claims about itself, right? So the Mormon Church makes claims that it is the source of revelation. So the LDS Church is not saying that Joseph Smith and just his writings are the source of revelation, but that the church is the continuing source of revelation. So if we have to trust that the church is this ultimate source of truth, I think we can then go back and say, okay, well, is there evidence that this source of truth, the Mormon Church, the LDS Church in this case, is actually telling the truth? Is there evidence that it's consistent? Is there evidence of, claims that it's made being verified repeatedly at various points? And what you see is a series of contradictions. Now, the LDS Church has not existed for all that long at this point. And the amount of contradictions on basic fundamental claims and the amount of shifts is kind of amazing within such a short historical time frame. So there are many examples of this that we could point to. The most famous ones are ones that are pointed out by the fundamentalist Mormon believers. So if you look at fundamentalist Mormons, they make claims that the LDS Church is apostate and that they're inconsistent with Joseph Smith's teachings. And the fact is they're right. They can prove very clearly, they can prove that the things that Joseph Smith and Brigham Young said are totally inconsistent with things that the church says today. So there are some examples that people are very familiar with. Polygamy, of course, being the first and most notable example. When you read the earlier statements on polygamy, especially Brigham Young, okay, so Brigham Young, I think, is even a more problematic figure than Joseph Smith in many ways. There's some weird stuff there. He believed that there were men on the moon. He supposedly got a revelation that there were men on the moon that looked like Quakers. Like, you get all these weird revelations that we can verify. We've been to the moon. There are no Quaker men unless they're hiding somewhere. I don't know, but we've never seen them. So it's some really weird stuff like that. But then you look at some of his what he says about polygamy. It's clear that polygamy in Brigham Young is really essential to exaltation, so that it's really necessary for the salvation of men that they live polygamous lives. And then later on, there is a revelation that now polygamy is, not only not something you have to do, but you can actually be removed from the LDS Church for practicing polygamy. So there's something that's very fundamental to the early Mormons that then becomes rejected. Now, the most famous one probably today is African Americans or not just in America, but blacks in the priesthood, which was something that was forbidden at Joseph Smith's time, clearly was a result just of racist attitudes in the United States in the 19th century. Really problematic. But this was revelation. Now that has shifted all of a sudden. So there are a lot of problems with that. But you see this with some doctrinal teachings as well. So, for example, the Adam God idea, this notion that Adam was actually God. Now, that sounds a little wild, but that is very clear in Brigham Young. I mean, it's repeatedly in the writings of Brigham Young. It's not like a one-time statement or a two-time statement. It is over and over and over again. Brigham Young is very clear that this is something that is revelation that he has received, that Adam is God. Now, that's rejected by the LDS Church. Same with, blood atonement and many other ideas. So even in the issue of like, where is the actual location of, where's the location of the Book of Mormon peoples? Where does this happen? Look at the example of Zelph. Now you can look up this story and read it if you're not familiar with it. You should. But there's an instance where Joseph Smith has this whole story that's revealed to him about this. It was a Nephite they encountered who had died. And it was a Nephite, am I correct? Someone will correct me if I'm wrong about that. But if you read the story, it's very clear that what the implication of it is this, the heartland, the United States. This is clearly where these things occurred. And the LDS Church changes on that. So this is consistent. I mean, it's constant that the church is changing its positions on various issues. And it certainly does not make it appear as if the LDS Church is the kind of revelatory institution that is deemed trustworthy. And the same is the case for Joseph Smith himself. So there's a lot more I could deal with any of these things. I know that Mormons in the comments are going to point out the responses to all of the things I've said, and I can't address everything in one video, and this is longer than most of the videos in this series are. But I hope you enjoyed this. Thanks for watching. Make sure you do subscribe to the YouTube channel, and you can subscribe to our podcast on your podcast app. Just look up Justin Sinner. We'll see you in the next one. God bless.